Welcome everyone to today's festival. Few introductory remarks. Of course, we'll be speaking with Chris Offutt in a few minutes. But before we start, we want to thank Humanities TN for sponsoring the festival, the Southern Festival of Books, and this is the 33rd year. This is a free event supported by individuals who have donated to support Humanities TN. And if you want to be one of those individuals, you can go to the app and contribute or visit www.humanities.org. As well, we have Parnassus Books of Nashville. Parnassus is the official bookseller for the festival. You will have the opportunity to purchase one of Mr. Offutt's books if you follow the buy link at the top of the chat. So purchases through Parnassus help to keep the festival free. Also, we would like to thank the Metro Nashville Arts Commission, Ingram Content Group, the Tennessee Arts Commission, and Vanderbilt University. So welcome everyone. Today it's my privilege to have with us, in conjunction with Oak Ridge Public Library, Chris Offutt, a widely published and distinguished author, also university professor at the University of Mississippi. Some of the critics have said this about his work. In Kentucky Straight is bourbon with no mixer. It is a story told and seen without nostalgic gloss. Another critic said, I believe Mr. Offutt knows the same world I do, and his talent for writing about it shines on every page. Another critic described his work as beautiful and brilliant. And from his latest work, The Killing Hills, we have this. The Killing Hills is a potent mix of magnificent prose and uncompromising honesty. It has the resonance of a murder ballad and the deeply existential themes of an epic poem. Its voice will linger in your mind long after the final page is turned. So today we welcome Chris Offutt. Thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thanks for having me, William. Glad to be here. Hi, folks.
Hello. So just to get us started, and of course, we will be accepting questions from the audience throughout. So please feel free to post your questions if you're viewing from Facebook or if you're viewing from YouTube, and I will pose those to the author. But to get us started, I noticed Mr. Offutt in A Tale of Two Americas. There was a comment made from this book that shared experiences via the writer and reader relationship break down boundaries and alleviate suffering. Have you witnessed or experienced this as a person and a writer as far as what books can do?
Well, I don't know if it's something I've necessarily witnessed. I believe I've experienced it just through my own reading books written by and set in environments that are extremely unfamiliar to me, where it changes my perspectives of those worlds and gives me insight into the people and the culture and a way of thinking. So maybe a self-witness, if that's even counts.
Oh, definitely it does. I think I read in one interview that you said when in terms of speaking about unfamiliar environments, that you tried to approach writing, let's say, your fiction as if you were writing from a person who was not familiar with that culture. Can you explain a little bit how you do that? How do you get to that point of view?
Well, I mean, most people in the country and certainly in the world are not familiar with the culture of Eastern Kentucky. Appalachia is a big area, so I'm really not um, speaking for all of Appalachia because it takes in a huge terrain.
Mm.
But I do feel as if I'm pretty. I know 4 square miles extremely well, and and better than better than most people who would read a book. So it's just a case of the tricky part is to make sure that the world is presented as it is without worrying about trying to reassure the reader or spoon feed the reader or define colloquialisms for the reader, and to anything like that I try to include in a way that the context will explain to a reader what it is that what may sound off or incorrect or just utterly new. There's a context where the reader can then interpret the meaning of it. That's probably the biggest difficulty that I ever have to answer your question.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I noticed in The Killing Hills, for example, the characters, the dialect that you managed to capture is very well done. I know I and other readers, maybe that have read Southern literature, sometimes the portrayal of the dialect can take you out of the story if it's not skillfully done. So for you, does that come fairly naturally, given was this the dialect that you grew up with and you just write it down on the page, or do you have to go through an editorial process as a writer where you say, well, is this really recreating the authentic dialect I heard, or that kind of thing?
I mean, it's both, really. It is the world I grew up in, and it's essentially the way I think today. I don't always speak the same way because I'm not speaking to people from the hills on a regular basis. But then when I go back through it and revise, I mainly focus on the syntax because the syntax I think will imply and get dialect across rather than you'll see it with other people will use incorrect spelling to try to indicate a dialect or dropping or apostrophes to drop in exchange for like ing, like doing instead of doing. So I just try to focus on syntax, and I also believe that in general less is more, and because what's most important is communication between the characters and between the book and the reader.
Thank you. You mentioned this idea of having one dialect in one situation and then another when you go back home.
Yeah.
I think we can all relate to that. Maybe the formal term for that is coding, where we find ourselves consciously or subconsciously slipping back into, that dialect. So when you go back and visit, do you find yourself doing that?
I mean, yeah, it's just immediate and it's unconscious, and it's completely comfortable and familiar. So I don't have. There's no self-consciousness. There's no worry about it at all. I do think it's true for many people, not just people from Eastern Kentucky, but if you're someone who grew up in a particular place with a particular way of thinking, especially in a smaller community or neighborhood of a big city even, that imprints itself on you. And when you go back, it's just a pleasure to allow the brain and the mind to operate in such a safe and familiar way.
Almost like putting back on familiar clothes again, perhaps.
I would exactly say that, like an old jacket that you love and you find and it just fits perfectly. and you feel good when you wear it.
Right.
If it fits still. That's
Yeah.
if you haven't outgrown it.
I hear you. Another question. In Kentucky Straight, I believe was that your first memoir? I know there was a book before that.
It's a collection of short stories.
Oh, short stories, yeah.
And it was my first book, yes, 1992, I think.
92. So you've had a writing career for about 30 years now, a little over 30 years.
Yeah, I'm not really good at math, but something like that. Close to 30, around 30.
In the story, the first story, there's a story of sawdust.
Yeah.
And it's about the young man that is determined to get his GED, which is taken at the post office. So in that book, this is said, not one on this hillside finished high school. Around here, a man is judged by how he acts, not how smart he's supposed to be. I don't hunt, fish, or work. Neighbors say I think too much. They say I'm like my father, and mom worries that maybe they're right. What I wanted to ask you is, are there autobiographical elements to this particular story? I don't know if that happened to you, or if it's just a character, or if you knew other characters who were able to actually do that. And secondly, throughout your fiction, I know, for example, in The Killing Hills, a character says that around here, we've learned how to hide our intelligence, to outsiders, and maybe also to those in the community. So if you could speak to that cultural phenomenon.
Well, I think all my work has an autobiographical element, but it's very veiled. It's not direct, except in the memoir where it's overt. But the fiction has both emotional autobiography and touches of it. I mean, the GED was a way for. It's a general education diploma, so if you don't finish high school, you take this test, you get the equivalent so you can get a job. That's what it amounts to. I knew a lot of guys who did it, and women. More women tended to finish high school where I grew up than us boys. I had kind of quit high school to join the Army, and then failed the physical, so was kind of in a pickle, and had the crazy idea that going to college would be better than working at the hardware store. So I had to negotiate that. I also helped people as a tutoring for their GEDs, some neighbors. So that's the answer to that part. There were two parts of your question, but I lost track of the second one. I was thinking about the first one.
Oh, I think in a way you did answer the first part in terms of biography and the part about the GED. So yeah. In Kentucky Straight, there's a map of rock salt. Now, is rock salt a fictional representation of Halderman? I believe that's the community in which you grew up.
Well, yes and no. There is no map of where I grew up. It is called Haldeman, and by the time I grew up, it was 200 people. It had been a big mining town, really, with a railroad and a barbershop, and even some crazy tennis court back in the 20s. Seriously, but after World War II, everything just took a nosedive, and there was nothing left when I was a kid, but just old railroad tracks, empty mines, and crumbling down buildings, a lot of them, and very few people, and dirt roads. So at some point, I can't remember exactly when it happened, the federal government shut down the post office in Haldeman, which meant it rescinded the zip code. So in a way, on a federal level, Haldeman ceased to exist, my hometown, and there was not a map for it. So I decided that I would include a map in my first book. It was a sort of a youthful fantasy. If I ever get in print, I will put a map in there of Haldeman. but it's not strictly a map of Haldeman at all. It's based on the terrain, but again, all the place names are invented. There's a Licking River in real life. I roughly changed it, I think, to the Blue Lick River, but it runs in a different direction. So it's yes and no is the answer to the question. Same with autobiographical elements.
Okay. I think you said somewhere that, your dad loved maps, and you thought if you included a map in Kentucky Strike that he'd be proud of you. Was he?
No idea.
Oh, yeah. So, yeah, a lot of fathers are taciturn. I have one too.
Not me. In fact, today is my son's birthday, and I'd like to say happy birthday, James. He's 27 today. I doubt if he's watching this. I think he's probably out wandering around in the woods or the desert somewhere. So, but anyhow.
Great.
Happy birthday, Jimmy Z.
Shout out to James. Is he going to follow in your footsteps as a writer or some kind of creative field? Or?
I doubt it. No, I mean, I think that my son, I have two sons, and they saw the perils of this kind of life up close, like the lack of money, fretting, being at home all the time. They both have other interests. One has an MBA and works for the big car company in Detroit, and the other one, whose birthday it is active in online marketing. So they have no interest in it. They want to make money. That's what happens when you grow up.
Yeah.
Living in the tight circumstances.
Right. Understand. Chris, we do have a question from an audience member, and it is this. So you are a college professor now. Do you feel that your students relate at all to the experience you described of college being an unusual pursuit when you grew up?
Yes, and in fact, I bring that up. I always bring that up. At the University of Mississippi is a small state in terms of population. It's mostly rural. There really isn't a big city. Jackson is a city, but it's by other standards in the country, it's small. So the majority of the students are from small towns and rural areas. And I know exactly what it feels like to A, want to get away, B, get away, and C, show up in what is essentially a small college town and think you've hit Paris or New York, and feel overwhelmed and scared. And I bring this up at the beginning of most of the classes, and I think it really helps me reach the students, and they realize that yes, there's definite age difference, and he's an authority figure and all that, but he has gone through a version of what they are going through now, minus social media, I guess.
Yeah. No big change there, right? Okay. Briefly, touching back on Tales of Two Americas, I was fascinated by that essay because of the way you wrote about your internalized struggle for what was being asked from you, which I found kind of comforting, actually, to see that and see how you wrote about that. So the story in that is you were approached to write an essay about trash food for a Southern Food Symposium, which eventually became the essay's title, which is brilliant, I think. And I think you experienced that as a diminution of Appalachian culture, kind of, to do that. But when I read the essay, to me, it had seemed like you put your finger on where some of these cultural divisions were located, including your penetrating self-analysis about your reaction. And later I found out in an article that you've been approached to write more on this topic, and finally you did in Harper's, and you wrote In the Hollow. But after a lot of prodding, and finally I think they offered to pay you more money and let you do a little bit more of what you wanted to do. So you said, okay. So you did mention, though, that you tend to avoid speaking about politics overtly. Can you speak about this dilemma as a writer or professional, why you avoid it?
Well, I don't think it's a dilemma. It's boring to me. You know, politics is always reduced to either or. Most politicians are, they're professional liars, and they're trained into it by law school. And then an election is either your favorite liar gets elected or the other person's. And then you just wait until the next election and hope that, you're satisfied. So to me, it's the topic is it's short-sighted, and it doesn't have a lot of interest. You can stand back and watch what's going on in the world and get really profoundly depressed or outraged or irritated or something like that. I would just rather write about life in the hills and the people. Now, you could also make a case, and I've made this case, although it may be specious and people have argued with it, that my choice to write about a marginalized community in the United States of America is in and of itself a political stance and political act. But that's about it for me. It's like religion, I don't talk about religion or politics at the table.
Yeah, I think what you said about how you may write about it, I remember in The Killing Hills is a double entendre, right? I mean, there's a murder there, but at one point somewhere in the novel, the point is made that the life expectancy of Appalachians is way below the norm, and the character says these hills are killing us. So you kind of do make a political statement in there in a way.
Well, I mean, it's also a health statement, the lifespan in the rest of the United States. Now, this is before COVID. Now, those statistics may skew everything, of course. But in the hills, the lifespan was actually, people 20 years ago lived longer than they have now. And it's much more of a comment to me about health and the OxyContin problem, and the lack of access to health. If that's politics, well, okay. But it surprised me when I learned that information, and so I wanted to include it in the book. Really surprised me. Then, of course, I'm moving to Mississippi, which is, I think, one of the next lowest. So, just by virtue of where I grew up and where I live, I could keel over any minute, man. That's a joke, people.
Well, we're looking a lot more closely now. That's all.
The pressure's on. This could be it. Could be the last one.
We're getting more viewers coming in by the second now after you just said that. Okay, another question from the audience. What made you decide to write a mystery, and how was it different from other types of writing that you've done?
Well, I don't think it is that different. I mean, this is my third novel. I always wanted to write novels. I use short stories as a means to learn. They're short, they're finite, and I could experiment with point of view, setting, character, and they're extremely difficult to write as a form, but they were very valuable in terms of lessons. And then that I would then apply to novels, which I finally got around to. Writing novels. But even with Kentucky Straight and Out of the Woods, those two short stories and the two previous novels, there are elements of crime in all of them, whether they're the characters of bootleggers or marijuana growers or police officers. The book before this had, I think, 3 homicides and a stint in prison. The first novel dealt with a homicide and a vengeance killing in flight. So I had always thought that this was what I was writing, and it was never, it just never came up. People didn't talk about it. So I thought, well, I love these sort of dark noir crime novels. There are very few set in the rural environment. There just really isn't. So I thought, how do I make sure that everybody knows, right up front, that's what I'm doing? Well, I just used an ancient trope, which is there's a dead body on page 2. So like once there's a dead body on page 2 discovered, then anybody who reads it will think, oh, it's that kind of novel. And suddenly it became that novel. So to answer the question, I don't think it's different from others, at least from my perspective. And I didn't really just decide to write it. I just just put this poor lady on page 2, dead in the woods.
That's how you started.
Well, that's how the book begins. Yeah, I don't know how I started. I don't remember how, what I started with. But through the revision, I move everything around. Every book I've written has been at least double the length in the first draft, because I just write and not worry too much about how it's all going to work together till later. For me, writing is revising, and I have to write a first draft to figure out what it is that I've got, and then figure out how to revise it.
How many times would you say, or in terms of revision, do you go through the whole thing, the whole novel? And if so, how many times do you go through the whole thing? How long does it take you to revise typically a novel? Months, weeks?
No, I go through the whole thing. I don't revise until I have a first draft. That's been a sort of a rule of thumb for me for most of my life, for very pragmatic reasons, actually. So I don't look back at anything until I have a full first draft. I started doing that with short stories. With novels, it's more daunting, simply because I can't keep the entire novel in my head the way I could a short story. And then I print it out, look at it, begin with making the real obvious changes, where through the course of the book there's place names or character names that I changed or forgot or got close to or something. And then look at structure and print that out. And I just print out each draft. I print them out, and I make hand comments throughout, label all the drafts, and then take that and plug that into the computer. So the current draft is always visible on my computer screen. And then there's a big stack, a growing stack of drafts, which I can then dig back through in case I accidentally threw out the baby with the bathwater. If I cut a whole paragraph and realize, oh man, there's something back there I need. Where was it? So the first revision is probably the most extreme, because it just is, there's a lot of chopping, then a little to get it down to what's essential. And then after that, it's tightening, tightening and expanding. It's like a bellows, one of those old time bellows that people would have to you do this, and there's a leather kind of a contraption on 2 handles with a tube coming out, and it blows air underneath the fireplace grate. So that's kind of how I see these revisions. It expands and contracts in the same way that a bellows does, and feeds the flame of narrative. So then eventually I get a draft where I'm changing conjunctions to commas, and then the next draft I'm changing commas back to conjunctions, and I realize, okay, I've done the best I can. There's nothing more to do, so I send it out the door.
Do you tend to put your drafts away for a certain period of time to let them sleep, to come back to them and see new things, or you just work straight through them?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, there's no strict protocol for that or formula, but yeah, I do. I wait. I think it's important that I, to revise requires kind of a fierce objectivity about my own work, which is the complete opposite of the effort to write, especially first draft, which is extremely subjective. Like I said, those first drafts are double the length of the final, and that's because I put everything in there, then except the kitchen sink, and then throw the kitchen sink in, and turn the water on, and there's an overflow on the floor, and all that. So at a certain point, I set them aside. Sometimes for a couple of months, and other times for a year or so. All of this just helps me generate the necessary objectivity so I can come back and go, oh man, what I thought was brilliant 6 months ago, really, it just stinks up the place. This is awful. But, in the white hot heat of writing, it's, I think that everything is really good. And then later, that's never the case.
Yeah, I can relate. I always thought my college essays were perfect, first draft, and
yeah, you go to bed thinking you're a genius, and you wake up and realize you're a moron. That's how it is for me.
Yeah. So you've written in so many different forms. So you've written memoirs, fiction, nonfiction, essays, screenplays. I think you were perhaps studying to be a playwright in college. I don't know if you wrote dramas at that time or not, but what's your favorite form in which to write?
I mean, I love writing novels. It's my favorite. It's what I always wanted to write, and I got sidetracked by screenwriting for purely financial reasons. Those two boys I mentioned wanted to go to college, and I didn't have any money, so that's where the money was or is. Once they were able to graduate, I quit doing that. I think short stories they're extremely difficult because they have to be real super tight and nothing wasted. They're a good training ground for me, but my favorite is novels. And this book that we're talking about, The Killing Hills, I want to keep writing books about these characters set in that world for a while. I don't know how long, until either I run out of steam on it or get an idea for something else.
Yeah. Let's talk just a moment about the character in The Killing Hills. I think it's Mick Hardin.
Yeah.
He's an interesting character to me. I mean, I can't say that I've read a lot of thrillers, but I have read some, like the Lee Child stuff and that kind of thing. But as a protagonist, he strikes me as a bundle of contradictions. I mean, he's in the Army, CID, he's an investigator, he's he's been a combat veteran. He comes into his hometown, his sisters become the sheriff, there's a murder. She approaches him to help her with it because she thinks he can in a way that she can't. And there's, and I'll get back to that in a second, but there seems to be in his character a restraint. He doesn't just display violence reflexively and without forethought, but he's capable of that if it needs to happen. But he's also very empathetic and understanding with those around him, which seems to contradict the stereotypical, unfortunately, male protagonist. So the second thing that I note in that novel that's refreshing is The Killing Hills reminds me a bit of Winter's Bone. There's this trek through the hollers, and there's a code that has to be honored in order for these people to help you. And if you can speak a little bit about the protagonist and how you came to that character, and kind of the background, the setting for that novel.
Well, the setting is it's essentially where I grew up. And like I spent my first 21, maybe 22 years there. I moved back twice as an adult because, like many Appalachian people, I just left and got homesick and went back home. So that's where the setting is, and I like setting it there for two reasons. First of all, most of my books are set there. First of all, I don't have to do a lot of research. I already know it. I don't have to fool around with going to the library and trying to figure out this and that. I don't think I could write a historical novel, for example. Research becomes tedious for me. And second, I still miss Eastern Kentucky. I still miss where I grew up and some of the boys I grew up with who are still there. And so writing, setting the work there allows me to deal with that homesickness. In fact, every day I can just kind of go home in my imagination and smell the woods and hear the birds and see the beautiful landscape and talk to people. So that's a big reason why I set it there. As far as Mick goes, I mean, you mentioned, like, he's not a stereotype and he's a bundle of contradictions. Well, that's interesting to me. And I think that's the case for most human beings. We are bundles of contradictions. And I thought the more interesting I make him, the more realistic, the more both flawed and trying to do the right thing would make him closer to the way people are in general, which goes back to that very first comment you made about what you can learn from other people. It's the empathy, like I'm an empathetic person, and I thought that this would be a good trait for a CID investigator who interrogates people. Like if you're trying to interrogate a criminal or someone accused of a crime, then a little empathy is going to go a lot further than trying to come off like some kind of tough guy. And we see that kind of junk on movies and TV show and in a lot of books every day. And I just didn't want to write that kind of book.
Yeah, we do have, Chris, thank you. We have a question from the audience. Has the pandemic affected your creative process or what you want to write about in any way?
Well, it certainly affected my creative process. I finished this novel right before that official lockdown began in 2020, I guess. And then, as a college teacher, I was on teaching via Zoom for a year and a half, and I just had a lot more, and I wasn't going anywhere, and I had more time on my hands. And I also loved writing The Killing Hills so much, and I missed them so bad that during the first phase of lockdown, I just wrote a sequel. And it's Mick, his sister, Johnny Boy, the same characters, the same location. It's a year later. And that book will be out in next June from Grove. It's called Shifty's Boys. Shifty is the name of a character, an older woman in The Killing Hills, and I just really loved her. And so I wrote, so that's how it affected me. Now, here's the thing. I finished that book when we were still in lockdown. And I thought, gosh, now what? Well, I'll just may as well try a third. So I'm underway on a third book in this same series, same place, same people. Things have changed, from their lives have evolved. But so in a way, the enforced homebodiedness helped my gave me more time to write. Now, I think it's an awful way that it came about. And in one way, I was lucky. My kids are out of the house, so I didn't have to deal with that at home. And I was able to continue my job via Zoom, so that helped. And I live out in the country and had a garden and a bunch of chickens, and a well. So I wasn't really too worried about starving to death. So as far as what I want to write about, no, I don't think the pandemic did. I'm sure that we will see books in the future that deal with this. Frankly, it's the last thing I will ever want to read a book about, which is the pandemic that we've all experienced, all very privately and all pretty hard. I've lost people through it, same as most of us.
I'm glad to hear that Mick is going to come back. I thought after I finished that you had established him as a character that should come back and had more to say.
Thanks.
Yeah. I wanted to read just a section out of 81 that brings up a thematic tension in the Killing Hills. It says, "A silence slid between them, broken by the ticking of numerous clocks. Mick wondered what his life might have been if his father had lived, if he had grown up here. He'd probably run a car lot or manage the IGA and wind up resenting his entire life. Job, town, wife, and his own thwarted ambition to get the hell out. Now he resented most of it anyway." I love that. And really that's indicative of the tension Mick feels, isn't it? I mean, he's coming home and he's part of him's glad to be home. Part of him feels some regret and he wants to leave and does leave. And his sister's as happy as she can be there. So, it's just, is this somewhat biographical where you also had that tension between wanting to be back or feeling like you're at home and yet wanting to be away?
Well, I mean, I knew that the things I was interested in when I was young were really not available where I grew up. Art museums, live theater, paintings, galleries, a good big library, these kinds of things. And I also had the idea that the rest of the country was just like Eastern Kentucky, except with taller buildings. That's really naively what I thought. And A, that wasn't the case. And B, I didn't fit into the outside world. By that, I mean the cities or anywhere outside of the hills of Kentucky. And I would return, for comfort. But then what I realized, now this is over time, I realized that the act of having left and exposing myself to a world, even if it wasn't for me, actually made it a little bit more difficult for me to fit into the world back home. So that in one way was my experience with it. The other thing is, I think that, and maybe this is just me or has to do with the aging process, but I think at different points in one's life, people look at their immediate circumstances, look at the past, and then imagine a future that is different. If I had done this, if I hadn't done that, if I had married this woman instead of that woman, if I had gone to art school for photography, which is what I love, instead of pursuing creative writing, or if I had done something if I had not failed the physical for the Army. Like, that's the one that I think of the most. And Mick, in a way, is a version of me, if in fact I had been able to join the Army at 18, and perhaps was a little bit more of a tougher guy than I am in real life.
I hear you. Well, Chris, we're getting close to the end of our wonderful conversation. Can you remind us again of the title of your forthcoming book and when that book will be due out? It's
this book is The Killing Hills. The second book in the series featuring Mick and his sister is called Shifty's Boys. That'll be out next June. The third book in the series will be out in June 2023, untitled, but right now I've got 240 pages. So with any luck, I can, and if I get a nice invitation from Serenity at the Southern Festival of Books, we'll all be in person next June for this new book.
Okay, that sounds really good. I was interested, the length of The Killing Hills is a sweet little 200 plus something pages.
Mm-hmm.
You got the same length for the next one, or is it going to be longer, you think?
I think it's a little bit longer. I actually think it's better, this second book, but that's just because I have enthusiasm of having recently finished. It's a little bit longer, and the third one is a little bit longer, and that might be a function of feeling more and more comfortable with what I'm trying to do. The people, the environment, the storylines.
Yeah. Well, I think Mick will give Lee Child's character a run for his money. And for those of you out in the audience, get on down to Parnassus or click the buy link and buy a copy of The Killing Hills. I've got it right here. It's excellent. You see how much flagging? It's flag.
I love that. I love that.
It's flag worthy. Let's just say that.
Flag worthy. That should be the next blurb on the back of the book.
Just one flag worthy exclamation point. That's it.
Oh man, thank you.
Thank you for joining us so much today, Chris.
It's been a pleasure.